registered nutritionist. She has a degree in food science and in nutrition. She also did German studies, so she's a linguist as well. She graduated from Oxford Brookes University in 2006. Madame Potter has extensive experience supporting individuals and groups to improve their nutritional health. She has worked in voluntary sectors in health outreach and community development, and in the National Health Service in health promotion in the London Borough of Lewisham. She has been a freelance nutritionist running Potter Nutrition since 2011 and is currently based in Manchester. Madame Potter runs workshops and courses for the general public and also trains other nutritionists. Madame Potter has a special interest in reducing health inequalities. That's probably why she's here. And of eating on a budget and cooking simple meals. So please pay much attention. And also this is the relevance to our diabetic topic. So she's going to talk about nutrition and its implication in diabetes mellitus.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm just going to share my screen so you can see my slides.
Yeah.
That does.
So thank you for inviting me to speak to you today about nutrition and its implication in diabetes mellitus. Thank you for that kind introduction, Dr. Julie. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about me, just so that you've kind of got a bit of context. So I, as well as working in the voluntary sector and the NHS, my freelance role also includes things like recipe writing and working for the BBC in terms of telling people about nutrition. So got a range of experience that I'm going to share with you today in terms of how to put into practice some of the healthy eating messages that you might have heard. So sorry, before we go on, I'm just going to give a little bit of context to this talk. So this session is not about telling you what to eat, what not to eat, although I'm going to talk about the advantages of eating certain things. You have a choice over what you eat, and that's really important that we recognise that, and it's about trying to help you make those choices. This session seeks to highlight some of the advantages and disadvantages maybe of having a healthy, balanced diet to reduce your risk of diabetes, and to show you simple changes that you might be able to make. I recommend doing small changes rather than trying to do everything all at once, and that makes it more sustainable and more kind of achievable as well. So this talks to show you the link between healthy eating and diabetes, and to help you make those changes. If you are diabetic listening to this talk, it's important that you talk to your health professional before making any dietary changes, because it may have an impact on the medication that you're taking, and on your diabetes management. It's also important, obviously, to make sure that you attend regular checkups and take your medication. This is not an alternative to medication if you've been prescribed it. I'm not able to give one-to-one diabetes advice. This talks to try and give you an overview of general diet for diabetes and for diabetes prevention specifically. So it can help. Diabetes can be managed with diet. It can also reduce the risk of complications if you've got diabetes. And it can reduce your risk of getting diabetes in the first place, especially if you're pre-diabetic. Intervening with that diet change is really important. So hopefully this talk will give you some ideas of things that you can do to do that. So first of all, I'm going to humor me for a bit. I want you to think about a question. So if you want to, you can close your eyes. No one can see you, so it won't matter if you don't want to do this or if you do want to do this. But close your eyes and think about this question. What is health? Think about picture you. What does the healthiest version of you look like? I wonder whether you have a specific image in your mind, or you have a specific way of describing how you feel when you're healthy. I want you to think about how you might walk, how you might sleep, how you might go about your daily business, how you might work. And perhaps you can think about that, even write something down, what that health looks like. You might even want to put in the chat what that health feels like. So when I think about health, I think about feeling good. And I think about being able to do what I need to do. Having not been well, particularly when I was pregnant with my 3 children, I was really not very well, and that absence of health was there. Being able to think clearly is something that's really important in terms of health. Just going to check the chat. So the other things might be having energy or feeling strong. For some people, it might be looking good as well. Not being sick, not having a cold. Health isn't all about what we look like, though, is it? Health is about so much more than that. And sometimes we can think about health, and particularly healthy eating, only in the context of weight. And actually, it's far broader than that. So I'm going to try and give you some ideas about what that looks like today. On the flip side of that, what does an absence of health look like? So think about what the opposite for you might feel like. This is not a comfortable feeling, but what might an unhealthy you look like? It might be someone else you can imagine who's not very well at the moment, and that's really hard to watch when you see someone like that. In COVID times, we know that a cough or a temperature or the lack of taste and smell is an absence of health. It might indicate COVID. Sneezing, coughing, wheezing, tiredness, irritability, unexplained weight loss, bloating, hormones misbehaving, pain, cell growth going wrong and ending up with cancer, those are all absence of health. Why am I talking about this? I'm talking about this because actually diet can have a massive impact on that health. And in terms of diabetes can produce many of the symptoms that I've described in terms of the kind of absence of health. So I know that others have talked about what diabetes actually is, but I'm just going to briefly recap so that you can kind of see the context within healthy eating. So there are 3 different types, but diabetes generally is when there's too much glucose in our blood, and glucose is the smallest sugar molecule that either you get glucose directly, you take in glucose, or the carbohydrates that you eat might be broken down into glucose. And if there's too much glucose in the bloodstream and your body's not able to cope with that, that's what causes diabetes. So there are 3 different types. The first one is when the body doesn't produce insulin, and so the pancreas doesn't produce the insulin, and it can't take the glucose out of the bloodstream and store it. Type 2 is when either there's not enough produced, or the insulin that is produced is not working properly, and so you get this insensitivity to glucose and insulin. So you kind of want to still want the glucose to be stored, but the body isn't able to use that insulin properly. The third type is gestational diabetes, and I know we've just had a pregnancy talk. So this is when the hormones associated with pregnancy cause problems with that insulin being used properly to store the glucose. That's a very kind of brief overview of what diabetes is, but essentially when we're looking at diet, we're trying to make sure that we're not putting too much glucose in too fast, but also we're trying to make sure that our body doesn't become insensitive to the insulin and get insulin resistance, as it's called, and so not be able to deal with that glucose. So thinking about thinking about diabetes generally, there are loads and loads of diabetes complications, sadly, and that's one of the reasons why we're talking about diabetes today, because actually if we can avoid getting diabetes in the first place, that's a really good thing. Just some overview of diabetes complications. So this list is quite a scary list from Diabetes UK, including eye problems, foot problems, heart attack, stroke, kidney problems, nerve damage, gum disease, related conditions like cancer and sexual problems. And a lot of the issues caused by diabetes are because the high levels of glucose are causing nerve damage, or they're causing damage to the vessels within our bodies, so blood vessels. So that's where we get our eye problems and our foot problems from. Also, issues around with sex in terms of damage to the vessels. So we're trying to make sure that glucose regulation is much better, and this is where diet is really important. So we really want to avoid getting diabetes in the first place. If you have diabetes already, then diet can also help to regulate that blood sugar alongside any medication that you've been prescribed. So take what you can from this presentation in terms of small changes that you might be able to make. So what can't we control? We can't control our age, sadly. If you're white, then you're and over 40, then you're more at risk. But actually, if you're Black African, Black Caribbean, Black Asian or South Asian, then your risk goes up over the age of 25. So after 25, you're more at risk. We can't control that. We know that. We can't control our ethnicity, but actually we're 2 to 4 times more likely to end up with diabetes if we are Black African or South Asian or Black Caribbean. So these are things we can't control. We can't control family history. You're 6 times more likely to get diabetes if your mother, father, sibling or child has had diabetes. And then things like medical conditions like high blood pressure, obesity, and mental health problems can also increase our risk. Why am I saying this if you can't control it? I think as someone who is of a South Asian origin, I know that my risk of cardiovascular disease and diabetes is higher than someone who's white, and therefore I work harder to try and reduce my risk in other ways. And so actually trying to, we can't change these things, but actually knowing them can empower us to make a change that perhaps will reduce our risk later on. So as I said, we can't control those things. I hope I haven't made you feel like you can't control anything though. There are plenty of modifiable risk factors, so things you can change. Things like sleep, actually having a good night's sleep on a regular basis is helpful for reducing diabetes. Not smoking and having a more active lifestyle, those are things that we can change. And then diet. So we can control diet. Now, you might feel like I can't control diet. I've tried, and every time I try and go on a diet, I don't succeed, and I feel like I'm failing. That is something that is not very helpful in terms of our kind of motivation to do something later, is it? When we've done something, we think, oh, I've done it already, I'm not going to do it again. But actually, I'm not going to put you on a diet today. That's not what this is about. This is about trying to find small things that we can change that are achievable and manageable. And hopefully by the end of the presentation, you'll have some ideas of things you possibly could change. So if you feel like you can't change anything, then maybe it's something we need to think about. What are the barriers to achieving that change? For lots of people, one of the barriers is time, and time to prepare what they think is a healthy meal. And actually, if they had more time, they would feel that they could make those changes. So we'll talk about some simple things that you can do that don't take lots of time. Budget can also be a really big barrier to healthy eating. The kind of perceived cost of fruit and vegetables or of quality proteins, that can be a perceived barrier to eating healthily. But actually eating healthily doesn't have to cost more. In some cases it can cost less than you're actually spending. It's about knowing that and helping you to do that. And you may feel like you need some one-to-one support from somebody, then that you can do that. But sometimes talking to a friend about the barriers can also help you to make those changes. So in terms of diet, the other barriers might be not knowing things, or not being sure how to cook, or having the facilities to cook, having people around you who eat a different diet, and then your diet is more in line with theirs rather than what you want, or caring responsibilities or work patterns. There are loads and loads of barriers, but let's try and work out what those barriers are individually and break those down. So I think you can control diet, but you need that help. You can also, we're going to look at weight, and we're also going to look at alcohol, which I know was mentioned earlier. So actually thinking about those in the context of diabetes too. Why do I mention weight? So there is a big link between weight and diabetes. So that's obesity and diabetes. And that's because the adipose tissue, where the fat is stored within the body, is used in the regulation of various processes, including immunity and inflammation. And it's these inflammatory molecules, so the adipokines and the cytokines, that can cause that development of metabolic diseases like diabetes. And you may have heard about obesity and inflammation in the context of COVID during the pandemic. So there is that link between weight and diabetes as well. So let's have a look at one of our modifiable risk factors, and I'm going to start off with alcohol. Why am I talking about alcohol in a nutrition talk? So you may think of alcohol just being a drink, but actually in terms of alcohol, it contributes a significant amount of calories to our diet. So 1 unit of alcohol is about 6 grams of alcohol. So, and that's about 56 calories. So you can see how quickly those calories can add up if you're having your 14 units in the week. So it's not something to say you can't have your 14 units, and the recommendation is to have those 14 units maximum spread over the week rather than having more at once. But just bear in mind that is a way of taking calories into the body. It's also a way of taking sugar into the body. So we often don't think about those in terms of what we're drinking. But the alcohol itself has calories, and then obviously any sugar that you have with it, then that will add more calories in. Alcohol in itself, aside from the calories, can also increase our risk of diabetes, because it affects the way that our bodies react to insulin. And for those of you who have diabetes, you need to be extra careful with alcohol because it can increase the risk of hypo, so when you get low blood sugar. So alcohol is where we started, because actually in itself it's a risk factor, and also it can contribute to weight gain, which can lead to obesity, and therefore is another risk factor. So it's it goes into both. So, and during the pandemic, alcohol consumption is reported to have gone up. So it's a key thing to start to think about if that is something that you are consuming a lot of. And there is plenty of support out there if you want to reduce your risk by reducing your alcohol intake. Moving on to the next area. So because diabetes can increase the risk of cardiovascular diseases, so if you have got diabetes, it's really important to watch the fat content of your diet, but also obviously fat and obesity can be linked. So the next area we're going to talk about is fat. So there are, pardon, we're next going to talk about, I'll come back to fat. Sorry, my notes are wrong. So we'll talk about fibre first. The reason why I talk about fibre is because it's a positive message. So I've told you about alcohol as being a in some ways it feels like a negative message, but fibre is a positive message to start off with. So in terms of fibre, You think about a traditional Ugandan diet, it's full of fibre. There's loads of fruit and vegetables, there's pulses, lots and lots of fibre. In the UK, we don't get nearly as much fibre as we should do. And the recommendation is 30 grams of fibre per day. So what we're looking for is to get fibre across the whole day. So that includes whole grains. We've got a picture of oats on the screen. That's an example of a whole grain. We've got whole grain pasta, whole grain rice, the granary style breads. Those will be whole grains. And then thinking about fruit and vegetables, at least 5 a day of fruit and vegetables, and we'll talk about those a bit later. And then some pulses in there as well. And this beautiful picture of pulses, and so lentils and beans are all pulses, and then nuts and seeds as well. And you need a large amount of fibre in your diet to get to that 30 grams. Most adults in the UK don't achieve that, and the average is about 18 grams per day. So why is fibre important? So fibre can actually slow down the rate that sugar is gets into the bloodstream. Now bear in mind that diabetes is about how much glucose is in the blood and how that's regulated. Mentioned earlier about insulin sensitivity. If you have these spikes in glucose after eating that are not fairly level, then you can end up with insulin sensitivity over time. That can increase your risk of diabetes. So fibre is not only really colourful on your plate if you're having fruit and veg, but also it can help with diabetes prevention. The other thing about fibre is it's great for our guts, and there's a really strong link between our gut health and our general health. There's also quite a lot of links between gut health and immunity, which is obviously really important, particularly in a pandemic. So we want to try and have the amount of fibre that we need. If you don't have any whole grains and you decide you're just going to have fruit and veg, you'd need about 10 portions in a day. And a portion is 80 grams per item. So if you think about an apple or a medium-sized banana or 2 clementines or 3 florets of broccoli, 3 tablespoons of sweet corn, those sorts of things are portions of fruit and veg. A handful is kind of what we're looking for. So if you were to have your just fruit and veg and you're going to have to squeeze all of that into your diet, you don't have much space for a huge amount of other stuff. So whole grains are important, and also the pulses. I'm just going to show you some examples of how much fibre is in different things. So put some on there. You might think, oh, that's a really tiny amount when it comes to the amount of fibre in it if you're trying to get to 30 grams a day. But actually, if you can look in the middle where we've got the red kidney beans and the red lentils, there's a huge difference between the types of lentils, but also the green and brown lentils and the kidney beans provide quite a bit more than lots of other fruit and vegetables. Something like sweet corn we know is quite fibrous, and so you can understand why 2.5 grams. That's 100 grams of sweet corn, which is probably about 4 tablespoons, depending on how heaped your tablespoons are. And so that's a reasonable amount of sweet corn to have with a meal, but it's still only providing 2.5 grams. So you can see why you need to have whole grains across the day, and also your fruit and veg and your pulses. So if you start with fibre in your day and you build your meals around fibre, you will find that you're more full than you're eating other things. So you're able to eat less, but also it does provide a huge range of foods. Fruit and veg have got so many different ones, and obviously a lot of different carbohydrate foods. So on this list that I've got on the screen, you've got cassava, plantain, sweet potato, yam, millet, would all be the kind of starchy carbohydrate foods. then we've got the sort of protein-based foods in the middle with red kidney beans, red lentils, green brown lentils. And then you've got almonds as well that kind of fit into that. And then you've got your fruit and veg. So you can see that actually fibre comes from a range of different foods. So what are some simple swaps that you could make if you have a lack of fibre in your diet? If you're having cereal for breakfast, you could perhaps switch to whole grain cereal, or you could put some nuts on your cereal or some fruit. If you prefer to have something with toast, you move to a whole grain toast, and perhaps put a grilled tomato with it. If you're having more of a kind of cooked breakfast, think about having a fibrous some sweet potato with it, rather than a white rice, for example. If you're having a meat curry, then perhaps add some lentils to that meat curry. Not only will that be more filling, but also it will increase the fibre, and it will reduce the cost as well, because red lentils and green lentils are much cheaper than meat would be. And then in terms of snacks, maybe having some unsalted nuts or some yogurt and fruit as a snack instead. So those are some simple kind of ways to increase the amount of fibre that we have in our diet. Moving back to the next area. So we're going to go back to fat. There are 3 different types of fat. We've got saturated fat, unsaturated fat, and omega-3 fatty acids that I'm going to talk about today. And as said earlier, because diabetes, you're more at risk of having cardiovascular disease, it's even more important that we watch the fat that we're taking into our bodies. So this helps to regulate weight, but also it helps to make sure that we've got high levels of cholesterol and then further increasing cardiovascular disease. So the saturated fat is the one that increases cholesterol specifically, and saturated fat can be found in things like butter, lard, biscuits, cakes, pastries. It's the visible fat on meat, but it's also found in coconut oil. And I know coconut oil is something that is much more popular than it used to be, and lots of people think it's incredibly healthy. I'm going to switch to coconut oil, it's going to be great. But actually it's very high in saturated fat. And although it is a plant-based fat, it can increase the bad cholesterol. So it's worth trying to reduce that in your diet. Not only do we want to switch to unsaturated fat, we also want to reduce the total amount of fat that we're having. So trying to reduce the amount of fat that we're putting on our bread, how much fat we're putting in a curry, how much fat we are putting on vegetables to then cook them in the oven. So thinking about the type of fat we use as well as the amount of fat. Unsaturated fat is a better fat. It doesn't increase the bad cholesterol in quite the same way. And the best types of oils would be something like a rapeseed oil or an olive oil. Rapeseed oil is the one that you find that's called vegetable oil. If you look at the label, it's usually got a pretty yellow flower on it, or if you look on the back, it will say rapeseed oil. You can buy rapeseed oil as cold pressed rapeseed oil, but that's far more expensive, and so it's worth just looking for vegetable oil, and that's usually the cheapest oil anyway. It also doesn't have a flavour, so in terms of having it when you're making curry, it doesn't give you that kind of slightly olive flavour in a curry. The omega-3 fatty acids are what are found in oily fish, and although there are some plant-based ones, so walnuts and flax seeds, and in rapeseed oil, there's not the same benefit as the ones found in fish. So the recommended portions of fish a week is 2 portions of fish, one of which should be oily, and oily fish would be something like salmon, sardines, mackerel, herrings, kippers. These are all oily fish, and a portion is 140 grams. So if you look at the labels on the packets, you'll often find that portions are far smaller than that for oily fish, but actually a portion to get enough omega-3, which will help reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease is 140 grams. That's 140 grams of white fish and 140 grams of oily fish. You probably expected me to start with talking about sugar because of diabetes, and I mentioned glucose earlier. The reason I haven't is because I feel that actually alcohol, as I said, there's two areas that can reduce the risk of diabetes. Fiber is a more positive message, and I think it's helpful we start with a positive message, and fat, because again it links in with the cardiovascular disease. We can automatically be quite kind of like the sugar police when it comes to sugar. I'm not telling you not to eat any sugar, that's not helpful. But what we need to be aware of with sugar is how much we are eating. So the recommendation for sugar is no more than 30 grams a day, which you might think is actually quite a lot. But free sugar is found in lots of things. And why is it called free sugar? Free sugar includes fruit juices that are in products, or fruit purees in products. It also includes things like honey and also cane sugar, but lots of different sugars come into this free sugar. It doesn't include sugars naturally found in milk. So if you look at a bottle of milk or a plain yogurt, you'll see it says of which sugars, like on this packet on the screen, it says under carbohydrates of which sugars. In a milk product, as long as it's not got added sugar, you don't need to worry about those sugars. They are very different, and the body responds to those in a different way. We're looking specifically at free sugars. So that if you look at this packet of Cocoa Pops, or they're not actually the branded Cocoa Pops, these are own brand Cocoa Pops, the amount of sugar on the label on the screen, you can see per portion is 11 grams. So you think, well, okay, I can have some of those maybe 2 or 3 times a day. A portion, I'm going to show you a little pot. So this is a pot that in the UK you can get hummus in, that sort of size pot. A little tiny bowl cup, that's a 30-gram portion, which even for small children would be quite a small portion. You'd probably complain and ask you for more. It's worth actually, if you're having a breakfast cereal or you're having a product that's got sugar in it, to weigh that out. Not every time. We're not going to be obsessed with the amount of sugar we're having, but just so you're aware of when you are having your sugar, because it may be that you're having 100 grams of that cereal, and so you're already having 35 grams of sugar in your breakfast. Sugars are in all sorts of different products, pasta sauces, curry sauces, there's sugar in bread, there's sugar in all sorts of things to help the formula of those products. So have a look at the labels and see what the sugars are. And if you're not sure, there is further information on the NHS website about how to read the labels. And in the UK, the traffic light labelling can be helpful in some cases. Also, in terms of sugar, things like bought cakes, so the little brownie bites you might buy in the UK have a lot of sugar in them, and 6 little brownie bites, and they're about 1 inch square, would take you up to your 30 grams immediately. So again, I'm not saying don't have sugar, but be aware of what you're having sugar in, and try and have sugars at your meals rather than having sugars throughout the day. This is important just for our glucose regulation, and also we maybe want to start thinking about how picky we are with sugar. So do you really want that biscuit? Do you really want that cake, or is it just a habit? I, a few years ago, decided I was going to try and have 1 sweet thing a day, and not be really strict about it, and say I'm not going to ever have 2 things, but in our house we try and have 1 sweet thing a day. If I'm tempted to have something different, I'm actually much more fussy about what I have now, because I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to have 1 thing. I'd rather have the homemade cake than have the biscuit in the meeting, or in non-COVID times, obviously, or whatever's in the cupboard. I'd rather have the thing that I really want. And so maybe slowing down a little bit, and we'll come back to that, can help that process of, do we really want the sugar? It's also worth saying at this point, sugar in drinks can be quite high. So again, check the labels and see what you're having. If you're drinking plain juice, then the portion size of plain juice is 150 mils. And this is a 300 ml bottle. If you drank half of it, that would be one of your portions of your 5 a day. If you drink the whole bottle, you've got one of your 5 a day, but you've also got 150 mils of sugar to go with it. And each of those 150 mils will then contain 15 grams of sugar. So stick to the amount of juice that they recommend with 150 mils. Otherwise, that will add on to your sugar as well. So it's a whistle-stop tour so far. We're going to just talk a little bit more about sugar in the context of the glycemic index. So you may well have heard of the glycemic index. It's often used as a diet technique. I wouldn't recommend it as a diet technique. This is not a crash diet, and I wouldn't recommend crash diets. The reason glycemic index is helpful is we can see how quickly the glucose from different foods is released into the body. And I mentioned earlier about glucose sensitivity. When the body's not reacting to insulin properly, if you are taking in glucose and it's spiking your glucose levels a lot, then your body will get used to that and not necessarily be able to cope with that. So what we're looking for is low GI. And if you look at the slide on the screen, I'm going to try and describe this as best I can. You start taking the food in at the beginning of the timeline. So this is the graph that we're looking at. As your glucose is released into the bloodstream, this goes up. If you're having a high glycemic index type food, then the spike in your blood glucose goes up quite quickly and then drops down quite quickly. If you've got a lower GI food, then that spike is far lower and is spread over a longer period of time, and you gradually reduce, and you don't have that sudden drop. The sudden drop is associated with feeling really, really hungry. So you may well have had an experience like this, where you've had a breakfast and mid-morning you just get that real slump. That's probably because you've had a high glycemic index breakfast. If you're having something that is a lower GI breakfast, then that glucose is released far slower into the bloodstream, and you don't feel as empty quite as quickly, but also it's far slower. The other danger with that kind of drop, not only do you feel hungry, but you're also more likely to reach for high sugar, high fat foods to satisfy you. So ideally, we're looking for having a low GI breakfast to help us maintain that blood sugar. And maintaining that blood sugar is also much better for our blood vessels as we try and reduce the risk of those complications that we talked about in diabetes. So what is low GI? So I've put some on the screen. So you've got things like whole grain bread, rolled oats, pasta, sweet potato, legumes, barley, vegetables, and most fruits. Also things like green plantain or cassava will also fit into that kind of low GI. And then the higher GI is things like white rice, potatoes, white bread, cornflakes, brown flakes, instant oats, and melon and pineapple. Sorghum would also fit into the high GI, and baked sweet potato would also fit in there. So there is a difference between some of the cooking methods as well, depending on whether you've mashed it or whether you've boiled it or whether you've baked it. And so it can get quite complicated, the glycemic index. But essentially, if you've got a food that is higher in fibre, then that food will be broken down, digested slower than something that is more refined. So compare white rice with brown rice, for example. If your body digests it slower because of the fibre, it releases into the bloodstream slower, and you can see on the graph how that can be released slower and over a longer period of time, and you don't have that sudden drop. If you want to find out the glycemic index of many foods, you can go onto glycemicindex.com and kind of have a look at that. But as I said before, this is not a crash diet. This is a way of helping us maintain that blood sugar and feeling fuller for longer. And it's helpful not only for diabetes control, but also in prevention of diabetes. Moving on, the other thing I want to kind of focus on is portions. So let's focus on fruit and vegetables first. I've mentioned the size of a fruit and veg portion. If you think about what you had for your last meal, would you say the portion of vegetables that you had on the plate was equal to a handful, 2 handfuls, 3 handfuls, or was it a little bit on the side? Often when we eat, we might put a little bit of colour on the plate, or we might put a little bit of lettuce in a sandwich, or we might put a few berries on top of cereal. We don't necessarily put 80 grams of that particular fruit or vegetable in that meal. So if we can start with our portions of vegetables and portions of fruit, you'll often find that you don't need as much other food. The picture on the screen is a British Nutrition Foundation document, infographic called Find the Balance, and that's got loads of information to look up on the British Nutrition Foundation website about what those portion sizes look like. They would say that about a third of the plate is vegetables, and that fits in line with the Eat Well guide in the UK. But there is evidence that actually half the plate should be fruit and vegetables. So third of the plate minimum. So we're looking for 5+ a day. So 5 handfuls, 80 grams each would be a kind of portion of fruit and vegetables. Moving on to the starchy carbohydrates, if we think back to our plate, do we normally put a load of rice on top and a little bit of vegetable, or is that more balanced on our plate? And perhaps reducing that amount of starchy carbohydrate and increasing the vegetables may well help you to regulate the portion sizes that you're eating. There's far more calories in starchy carbohydrates than there is in fruit and vegetables. So actually increasing fruit and veg not only increases our fibre, which is good for our gut health and our heart health, it can also reduce the amount of starchy carbohydrates. I'm not about cutting out the carbs. It's really important that we have those starchy carbohydrates, but they shouldn't be filling up half to 2/3 of our plate as often is the case. The other portions, the protein foods and dairy foods, we're looking at kind of the palm of your hand as the size of a protein portion. So a piece of meat on the hand, handful of beans, and dairy, 200 mils of milk or a small matchbox sized piece of cheese would be a portion of dairy. And then just small amounts of unsaturated fats and oils and spreads. So trying to kind of reduce those, as we've already talked about. I should also say that when we're talking about fruit and vegetables, that juice and smoothies are not as good as going for the whole fruit. So I mentioned earlier about 150 mils being a recommendation for a portion of juice. Any more than that, no matter how many different types of juice you have in a day, any more than 150 mils counts as free sugars. So you can only have 1 portion of juice in that 5 a day. Equally, you can only have 1 portion of dried fruit, so raisins, dates, sultanas, dried cranberries, will fit into those. The reason for that is because in the process of drying, all that sugar is condensed into the fruit, and although you're getting some fibre, you're just getting condensed sugar as well. Think about the difference between eating 3 prunes and eating 3 plums. So you don't fill up quite as much, but you still get the same amount of sugar. So again, with smoothies, they can only count as one, no matter how much stuff you put in it. And the reason for that is when you make a smoothie, you blend it. And when you blend it, the fibre starts to get broken down. So what your body would be doing in breaking down a fibre as part of digestion, your smoothie maker would have been doing. So when that smoothie hits your body, it's going to be released into the bloodstream far quicker than if you'd eaten the actual whole fruit. From a cost perspective as well, the amount of stuff that goes into a smoothie, it's far cheaper to eat the whole fruit in the first place. And the same goes for blending food to try and hide vegetables in the sauce for a child. Although sometimes that can be helpful, it does reduce the amount of fibre. So let's think about our plates and think about getting that balance across our plate. And also when we're thinking about portions, maybe it's helpful to go for a smaller plate as well. The other side of portions is how much we put on our plate and whether we force ourselves to finish what's on our plate. Particularly if food has been scarce in the past, or we've grown up with parents who've had that, or even grandparents who've been in a situation where their fruit and vegetable is not, they haven't got enough of it, or they haven't got enough food generally, they may well force us to finish everything on our plate. Now, I hate food waste. I'm not advocating food waste, but maybe it's worth putting less on our plate to start off with, and then we won't waste it because we could reheat what we've not put on the plate in the first place. It's also helpful to have a pause between, so have a small amount and then have a pause and then have some more, because it lets the food go down and lets us have a chance to figure out that we are actually full or whether we need some more food. The same goes for eating slowly, and life gets hectic, and I understand how challenging it is to eat slowly and chew well, but actually the process of digestion starts when we chew, and so that all the brain reactions, all those communications that need to happen with the brain to say I'm full, need to happen slowly, and our stomachs need to communicate with our brains that we are full. The slower we're eating, the more we're able to communicate before we then end up with that really full feeling and feeling quite uncomfortable and possibly bloated as well. The size of our portions can also be helped if we are measuring out portions ourselves. So if you think about when you grab a packet of something as a snack, you often finish that whole packet. It may well be worth buying a bigger packet and portioning out accordingly. So for example, if you're buying nuts, to then portion that out rather than just grabbing a bag of nuts. So we're going to just talk briefly about some weight loss tips, and I've mentioned some of them already. The reason I'm talking about weight is because of that very strong link between obesity and diabetes. And if you struggle with obesity, if that's something you suffer with, then it's not about laying blame. This is about trying to find ways to reduce the risk that of getting diabetes. There's a lot of stigma around obesity, and someone who is overweight will know that firsthand. And so this is trying to kind of find simple ways to reduce the weight. I really want to make sure that if this is you, then you get the support that you need. Some people become so obsessed with food that they can't enjoy it. And this is aside from an eating disorder, although eating disorders are definitely something, if you struggle with that, you need to go and get some support. But the disordered eating is something that's becoming more and more prevalent. And this is when you become obsessed with food, or you feel really guilty around food, or you're just thinking about food all the time, and perhaps eating really erratically. That can be really unhelpful as well. So it may be worth seeking some specialist support around disordered eating if that's something that you struggle with. With that in mind, these I would say are kind of my weight loss tips. The first one I've talked about already, so slow down. And a process that can be helpful for this is called mindful eating. So if you happen to have some food in front of you, you can practice this now. So you pick up the food and you look at the food, you feel the food, you smell the food, you might even lick the food. Depending on your culture, you might want to do this in private, I don't know, the first time you do it, just so it doesn't feel weird. But you slow down that process of what it feels like to have that food. And then you put it in your mouth and you slowly enjoy each mouthful. You slowly enjoy biting it, think about how it feels, think about how it tastes, think about the kind of sensations. Is it crunchy? Is it soft? Is it is it coating your mouth like chocolates in your mouth? It coats all your mouth. But slowing that process down, as I said earlier, can help with digestion, but it can also help us identify whether the food that we're eating is something we really want to eat, which can be helpful when we're thinking about those higher fat, higher sugar options that we're trying to kind of reduce. We may well actually not really like the thing we've just grabbed, but that's a kind of habit. You could try it with one of what you think is your favourite chocolate, and see whether that's something that actually you like all the flavours across this whole spectrum of when you first put it in your mouth and the aftertaste. And maybe it's something that you can then use for other foods as well. Build your so having a smaller plate. I've mentioned already. There's evidence that if you have a smaller plate, then you're going to eat less. You can also try and cut things up more. So if you grate cheese on a big grater, wide grater, then it looks less than if you grate it on a small grater, a narrow grater. So if you cut it up into little pieces, it looks more on the plate than if you have put a piece of cheese on the plate. So you can play tricks on your own mind with these things. But yeah, a smaller plate is helpful. Mentioned already, small amount and then having more if you need it. And then try and have a routine to food. So we use a different part of our brain to do the kind of habit stuff that we do. If you put your shoes on, you don't necessarily think about exactly how you're tying your shoelaces, you just do it. If you're driving a car, you don't necessarily think, oh, one foot has to go on the clutch and one foot has to go on the accelerator, and then I'm gonna go off. You just drive. Those things have become so much of a habit that we don't need to think about them in the same way, and they don't take as much energy from us. So what we want to try and do is building habits that can help be that kind of automatic response. So trying to have 3 meals a day might be something just to start with. Don't worry about what those things are. It might maybe just you need to start having that routine, and then your body knows I'm going to have food again at a certain point, so it doesn't go into starvation mode and think the next time I'm going to eat, I'm going to just store everything. It can also help with that blood sugar regulation that's so important for diabetes prevention. And then building your meals around vegetables can also help. So when you're trying to eat your 3 meals a day, think about what you're putting into those meals and plan your meals. When you're building your meals around vegetables, what I mean is, say for example, you're making a curry and you're going to make it for 4 people and you want it to include 1 portion of vegetables per person. You need to have 80 grams of vegetables in per person, so 340 grams in total in your curry. If you are going to make a curry that's got 2 portions in it, you'd need 640 grams in it. So it's worth thinking about how many people you're cooking for and trying to put that into your curry. If you're then going to have curry alongside a vegetable, you don't want to put so much in your grandma's favourite curry and ruin it, then perhaps think about having the vegetable on the side. Again, 80 grams of vegetable per person. But if you're building those meals around the vegetables, then you're going to be eating less carbohydrate and less protein. Although important, you do need to increase the vegetables. Shop with a list. It's really common for people to shop and not have a list with them, and then they end up buying things that they didn't plan to buy. The supermarkets want us to do that, but that's really not very helpful for trying to manage weight. And read the labels as well when you're around the supermarket. And I can't go into huge amounts of detail about label reading, but just knowing what you're eating can be helpful. Avoid crash diets. They don't work long term, and they actually can be quite dangerous. So it's about small changes and gradual changes, and keep moving as well. So there's a great app called Active 10, which is an NHS and Department of Health app in the UK. It's free to download, and it kind of helps you to regulate or to monitor how many bouts of 10 minutes of brisk walking you've done in a day. So it's not about doing the 10,000 steps a day, it's about that brisk walking in bouts of 10 minutes. I've just put on the screen an example of how you might put these things into practice. This is not a tested for all nutrients kind of menu. It's very much trying to achieve 5 a day, get some variety in the diet without breaking the bank, and also without spending hours in the kitchen. So I put cereal on there for breakfast. You don't have to have cereal, but you can see in that list you've got a variety of things with your cereal. So if you choose to have a different breakfast, mix it up a bit, have different fruit, different vegetables with it to get your variety, and choose a whole grain cereal for breakfast. Again, you don't have to have snacks, but if you do choose to have a snack, make sure you're trying to get that range of things across the day, and also trying to make sure those are not high glycemic index foods. So if you're having the crumpet, for example, that I put on there, you might want to put some peanut butter on it and reduce the glycemic index, or have it with some fruit. Lunches I put on are very simple lunches, because most of us don't have time to prepare a cooked lunch. It's possible you could prepare things the night before, and that's one of the reasons I've chosen the style of menu that I have. So, for example, I've said for dinner on Monday I'd have bolognese, and therefore we'd have some pasta. And if you cooked a bit of extra pasta, you could make it into a pasta salad for lunch the next day. Equally, suggested making things that you can then freeze half of it and then have another meal. So this is just a way of showing you that actually it's not as complicated as sometimes we make it out to be. It's important that we try and find ways that work around our own situation, and don't chain ourselves to the kitchen. So we're coming up to the end of my talk, but any changes that you make will take effort. That's as I said about the brain and how the brain works. We need to recognize that initial part will be effortful. So we need to decide first whether we really want to make that change. Are there things that are standing in the way of you making a change in your diet? And if there are, then maybe it's worth spending some time writing that down and thinking about how you might change the way that you think about those things, or you choose a different goal around diet that's more achievable. So I'll give you an example from my own experience in terms of exercise. I know that for me, someone who may get osteoporosis in later life if I don't do what I can now, weight-bearing exercise is important, so I need to keep moving. I prefer to not keep moving, so I enlist the help of a friend who I meet up with and go for a walk with. Having someone to support me in that process means I'm more likely to go for the walk. And it's worth thinking about that when you're deciding what you're going to do next. So think about a change you could make, based on what we've talked about today. It might be to add a portion of vegetables to a meal, or it might be to drink some water 20 minutes before a meal, and so your body's kind of expecting to have food and not so much food because it's because it's been hydrated already. Or it could be that you're going to try having a smaller plate. Decide what you're going to do, and then tell somebody. You could put it on, on social media and say, link to this session, and maybe tell a close family friend. You're more likely to do it if you tell somebody, but also encourage them to support you in that process. Maybe they could do it with you, because together we can make those changes. So good luck with the changes that you're going to make. I'm now open to questions. If you want to ask me questions, then feel free to put them in the chat.